Tonight, we're only going to take just, I think, seven verses is all we're going to get to tonight. And actually, I'm going to get to these 7 verses, and then next week I'm going to go back over a couple of 3 of the final verses. I think 15 through 18. I'm going to go over again in a different way. So if we're going to be really digging down in this part of Galatians. So tonight we're going to talk about the confrontation with Peter, and for those who are on the telephone rather than online, I'm going to go ahead and read this, Galatians 2:11 through 14. But when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. For before certain people came from Yaakov, James, he regularly ate with the Gentiles, but when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself, fearing those from the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not walking in line with the truth of the good news, I said to Peter in front of everyone, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Okay, that's as far as we're going to go right now, and then we'll continue on with through 18 shortly. So these verses focus on a theological conflict between Paul and Peter, and it took place in Antioch, Syria. Remember, we had Syria, Pisidia, which is in Galatia, or Asia Minor, now present-day Turkey, right outside of Ankara, what is present-day Ankara, Turkey. But this took place in Antioch. Now, the traditional Christian interpretation of these verses that I just read, it presupposes that Paul and the Jewish believers had the Jewish believers with him had given up on Judaism and the practice of Torah. When Paul saw Peter waffling on this matter by practicing some aspects of the Torah, such as returning to the Bible's dietary laws, he rebuked him for Judaizing. That is to say that Paul rebuked Peter for backsliding back to Torah and Judaism. Now, that is the traditional Christian interpretation of that verse. So we're going to take and look at something else here as we go on, and let's look at another interpretation. Now, this interpretation was by as a fellow by the name of Magnus Zetterholm, and he wrote a book on the approaches to Paul. It's a student's guide to recent scholarship, actually, I think it's the name to it, and it's a fairly recent book from 2009. Now, and I don't agree with all of these things that he's saying here, but it's a different approach. So let's see. If he said it was not at all self-evident that Paul intended for all Jewish believers to give up observing Torah. He's countering the traditional Christian view of this. He said, if the non-Jewish converts to Yeshua came from the pool of non-Jewish people who attended the synagogues, the God-fearers, they probably already had adopted most of the Jewish practices, especially with regard to food. That only makes sense. If the he's talking about people who are already in the synagogue, they were God-fearers. So, why wouldn't they have already adopted a lot of the laws that the Jews were already, the customs and so forth that the Jews were already following? So, the problem in Antioch, though, was probably the degree of intimacy that in their social relations. the ritual and the rituals involved in community meals, the seating arrangements, the handling of the food and the wine, was possibly a difficult concept for the more conservative visitors from Jerusalem that did not share Paul's theology of equal standing before God for Jew and Gentile believers. This idea of what to do with the Jews or with the Gentiles was still in a state of flux, even though Paul had gone to Jerusalem, discussed this with Yeshua's brother Yaakov, James. It was still in a state of flux. Not all of the questions had been answered. So these people from Jerusalem, they looked at this as a threat to their identity. So if the Messianic Jews and Gentiles were to fellowship together, then the Gentiles should be turned into Jews by circumcision. This is another interpretation of these verses. And so, like I said, I'm not really sure that I agree with all of his ideas as to whether this was the case or not, but it's pretty close. It certainly is much more in what I believe than the traditional Christian view that Paul was that these people were trying to get away from the law. They were not trying to get away from the law. So anyway, I want you to know how hard it was to get an aerial photo of ancient Antioch. I tell you what, those balloons that they had back in those days and the photographic equipment that they had was just not very good. But I was able to find this ancient photograph of an aerial view of ancient Antioch. Pretty good, huh? So, and if you don't like that one, then here's another one. Different view when the balloon was on the other side of the city. But I show you that to just say this, that Antioch was a big city. It was, we sometimes we just kind of gloss over some of these places that we talk about in the Bible, and we never just really think about, who these people were, where it was, or anything like that. Ancient Antioch, as we talked about last week, was about 300 miles north of Jerusalem, and it was about at least a 15-day journey if you were stepping lively along the coast road and you didn't run into any banditos along the way. It was about 15 days, assuming that you could walk 20 miles a day. And hopefully one of your sandals didn't have what's Jimmy Buffett say? Something blew out a flip-flop. So anyway, Antioch was founded near the end of the 4th century BC, and it was named for one of Alexander the Great's generals. Now, the city's geographic area, or its placement on a major river, put it right in the trade routes, and so it grew and grew, and it became the center of Hellenistic Judaism at the end of the Second Temple period. Basically this was the time of Yeshua, the second Temple period, first century. Most of the urban development of Antioch was done during the Roman Empire, so it was only within the last couple of hundred years that Antioch really grew, and it was one of the most important cities on the eastern Mediterranean as far as Rome's dominions, their area of conquest. The population at the time of Paul was estimated to be over 100,000, something like that. And this was it was called the cradle of Christianity as a result of its longevity and the pivotal role that it played in the emergence of both Hellenistic Judaism and early Christianity, and it was it was just an important place in the early days of Christianity, and I think I mentioned it later in the notes, but this was the first place that the believers in Yeshua were called Christians. So I think Michael McGuckin noticed that there was a country club there, and wondering if the Romans played golf there. I'm not sure they played golf, but they sure did like the ponies. So anyway, here we go. What was the problem with Antioch? What was the problem in Antioch? And it was eating together. It was against the halakha of the day for Jews and Gentiles to break bread together. Although we do know that some of the sages, and this question came up last week, so I hurriedly, well, not so hurriedly, but I finally found some information about whether the Jews and the Gentiles of the day ate together. Now, we know that, just as an aside, some of the sages disregarded this halakha of not eating together and fellowshipping. There's a Rabbi Meir and a Rabbi Hiya, who were they were guests of Gentiles. We do know this. And Shimon Bar Yochai, he visited a Gentile friend in Tyre. These relationships were recorded, and there's a Mishnah that, and if anybody's interested, I can give you the reference for that as to where it was recorded in ancient writings. But I do have that. There's a Mishnah, Avodah Zarah 5:5, that relates the rules and how to go about dining and drinking wine with the Gentiles, even in your own home. So they did have ways of getting around this, and evidently there were some who disregarded the overall general halakha of not eating and drinking with Gentiles. So when Dr. Rudolph last weekend asked all of us if Jews ate with Gentiles, and I proudly raised my hand and said, no way, no how, no, anyway, I was so wrong, and, live and learn, I guess. But you ought to know, when a professor gets up there and asks a question with an obvious answer, don't fall for it. So, anyway, that, let me go to the next slide here, or we'll just go through these PowerPoints here that I think I got them all. Some of the problems with eating with Gentiles, of course, it was against the halakha. There were some of these rules were that you couldn't eat the food if it was prepared by Gentiles. So you had to have your food that prepared by Jews. Or someone, I guess if you were in a Jewish household, then your slaves would have gone through a circumcision, and they were considered then not a Gentile. But still, the food should have been prepared by Gentiles. The problem with eating with Gentiles is the meat and the wine were probably offered to idols, and so that was a problem. They couldn't eat things that were offered to idols. That's in the Bible. That's biblical. And
the Gentiles' utensils would be contaminated.
Yeah, all of everything that they touched, anything that a Gentile touched would be contaminated. Even to the point that I read some stuff where they would go to the market, and if you buy something from the Gentiles, buy it the day before, because somehow overnight then all of the cooties went away, and so the next day the food was okay to eat.
Well, they did not believe in mixing meat and milk. And so in the Orthodox, even today, in the Orthodox families, they have separate cooking utensils and separate dishes for milk products and meat. And they're never, if you've ever cooked milk, a milk product, in a pot or pan, or you served it on a plate, you can never use that again then for meat, because those two things are never to be. So there's no way you eat with a Gentile, and of course those dishes will have, been contaminated by using those together. So it was not feasible. I mean, it's hard for an Orthodox family to keep everything straight, much less, eating with a Gentile. Of course they wouldn't have.
The question comes up that is there a Torah rule forbidding table fellowship with Gentiles to give the rabbinic legislation a grounding? I cannot think of one right offhand that would be a specific that says don't eat with the Gentiles, but at the same time, there were rules about assimilating with the Gentiles, and so in the attempt to make sure that you never broke the commandments of Torah, then they would build the fences around that, and
the response of Jesus for that.
So there was also a question about my photo. Was that a guesstimation based on archaeological dig? Yes, it was. That was a reconstruction based on what they have found. The ancient city of Antioch, the ruins are still there today. They built to the side of it in many cases. So that was as far as the wall going around it and so forth. It's an archaeologist's guess as to what it might have looked like, and I showed it just to bring out the point that Antioch was a thriving metropolis of the day, huge city for those days, 100,000 people, and a very, very important trade route and a military resource. And so that's why, just a lot of stuff happening there a lot of stuff happened there at the, in Antioch. So, the hand washing ritual was as a result of going to the market and being contaminated with Gentile cooties. So, that's kind of how that played itself out. So, okay. Okay, let's see. Now we're getting, I'd probably need to just wait until the end here, and we'll get, when we get to the end, we'll hit some of these things. But you guys, I think you can all see the chat stuff that's going on, and so we'll go back and hit some of them here in a little bit. Let's go ahead and go through this. What did Peter find in Antioch? Said Peter found a thriving community of Jewish and Gentile believers, and they ate and drank together. They were equals, brother and sister. Now, Peter, he came to Antioch sometime following the return of Paul and Barnabas from their first missionary journey to southern Galatia. So when would that be? That would we said that would be possibly someplace 48 to 50 CE, somewhere in that time frame. And he came to see the work being done there because Antioch had become the second most important city for Messianic Jews after Jerusalem. This is where the biggest population of Messianic Jews were at that at that point in time after Jerusalem. And, like I'd said before, in Antioch, this was where the followers of Yeshua were first referred to as Christians. The believers in Antioch wanted Peter to come and give them their firsthand accounts of being with the Master. And, wow, can you imagine what it would have been like to sit down and listen to Peter talk about his acquaintance with Yeshua and the stories that he could tell. It would be just interesting to sit down and hear something like that from Peter himself. And so what Peter found was, this big community of Jews and Gentile believers together. The Gentile believers kept the Sabbath and the festivals along with the Jewish believers to the extent that they were able. They ate and drank together at common meals, at ritual meals, at festive meals as equals and not as separate classes, but as brothers and sisters in Messiah. This is what Peter found there. And we had a question here. Let's see. Chuck had said, "Are you reading from a different Bible version?" The Hebraic Bible. I guess I was reading this as the Jewish meal law issue was just an example and not the true question of what Paul was addressing. I think we'll get into it in a little bit, Chuck, and if it doesn't answer the question, we'll talk about it here in just a minute. And Michael says, kashrut is based on the question, how do we avoid accidentally boiling a kid in his mother's milk? The arguments support kashrut or were worked out by Rashi and other and or Rambam, I believe. So, the dietary laws have been around even a long time before Rashi and the Rambam. So, I think they're still being hashed out even today, I think. So, anyway, we can talk about that more in just a little bit. Now I wanted to get to who were these certain men from James. Paul referred to them as the circumcision party, and which means that they were from the Jerusalem community of Jewish believers. We talked about the Ebionim, the Ebionites, the poor ones. They were from Jerusalem. They were Jewish believers, and they were probably very important people. Possibly, we don't know, but possibly even some of the original 12. We just don't know that, but they certainly had an impact on the Messianic community in Antioch. We don't really know why they came to Antioch, but we do know that as soon as they got there, they expressed their disapproval of the free intermingling of Jewish and Gentile believers. They believe the Gentile believers should be circumcised, not for salvation, they'll grant that, but for cultural reasons. If the Gentiles were eating, drinking, and fellowshipping with the Jews, then they should go on to the next step and become circumcised. If they chose not to do so, then they should be set aside from the Jewish community of believers, quarantined, I guess you could say, so that the distinction between Jew and Gentile was maintained. Sadly, we have sort of the same issue in the Messianic community today. This has always been an issue, and it's always the question. When Gentiles start doing Jewish things, it blurs those neat lines of distinction. Our problems in Messianic Judaism are not new problems. They are ancient problems, biblical problems, the same problems with which the disciples of the apostles and the apostles themselves struggled. So, as mentioned earlier, under their influence, Peter, Barnabas, and the Jewish believers withdrew from table fellowship with the Gentile believers. And Paul saw this immediately, perceived the consequences. Ultimately, two separate faith communities. That would be the end result. So Paul took a deep step and rebuked Peter. But Paul really had no choice in this matter. And again, this stuff was it was in a state of flux. It was before Acts 15 settled it once and for all what to do about the Gentiles. So there was still a lot of questions here. But can you imagine? Here the Gentiles have been eating and fellowshipping with the Jews, the Jewish believers, for a year, 2 years, 3 years, something like that. Who knows how many years this had been going on? Because Paul and Barnabas had been there in Antioch teaching this, so this had been going on for some time. And then all of a sudden, these people come from Jerusalem and start teaching otherwise, and Peter and Barnabas, all the leadership backs away from the Gentiles, and the Gentiles then who had been on equal footing with these people, then all of a sudden they become, as it were, second-class citizens in the community of Messiah. So Paul looked at this and said, "Oh no, this can't stand. We have to address this." And so that's what he had to do. Paul, there was really nothing else that he could do. He said that he confronted Peter face to face, and actually he did it face to face, and then it says in front of everyone else. That so Peter kind of got a dressing down. He definitely got a dressing down right in front of the crowd. And so Paul said that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. That's in Galatians 2:14. And we could take that to mean that their conduct was not in keeping with the halakha of the truth of the gospel. Now, of course, halakha means literally it's the walk. How do you walk this stuff out? And so basically what Paul is saying to these guys, you're not walking the walk here, guys, that the truth of the good news, the gospel, is that when you are in Messiah, that erases that distinction between the Jew and the Gentile with regard to fellowship. And again, we can't really stress how much fellowship meant in those days. After the temple was destroyed, the sages equated table fellowship with temple worship, because that's all they had left was their table fellowship. So it was just a very, very important thing. And this halakha of the gospel that we're talking about, or walking the truth of the gospel, this again going back to Paul's belief that Gentile believers are part of the Abrahamic covenant, and they are part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And you'll note in my first notes I'd left out the word Abrahamic covenant, and so it's important to say the Abrahamic covenant, not the Mosaic covenant. There is a difference, and they are part of the Commonwealth of Israel. So the halakha that Paul referred to was his belief, I'll get through my notes, that Gentile believers are part of the Abrahamic covenant, part of the Commonwealth of Israel. They were no longer Gentile pagans and sinners. This new quasi-legal status enabled Jews and Gentile believers to mingle freely, fellowship freely, worship together, and most importantly, eat together. The matter had been established after Peter saw the sheet coming down from heaven. In Acts, we know this story. And after Cornelius and his family came to faith in Yeshua, and they were filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. So, I don't know. I mean, at this point, that should have been well established. Unless and I got to thinking, unless the Messianic community in Jerusalem was also segregated, which we have no indication that it was, this practice in Antioch should have been accepted. I don't know what the actual makeup of the Messianic community in Jerusalem was, but at this point there had to have been Gentile believers in their midst, and perhaps they were segregated. I don't know. I don't think the Bible says so. So I think Ray's been reading my notes here, so we're going to go on. As Paul rebuked Peter face to face. Now this is in keeping with the words of Yeshua in Matthew 18:15 regarding a brother, discipline of a brother. He said, go to him privately, and I think Paul says that he went to him face to face, and he went to him also in front of everybody. So I don't know exactly the sequence of how all this happened, but Paul did confront him, and he tells him, look, if you are a Jew, you live like a Jew, or you are a Jew and you live like a Gentile, how can you expect the Gentiles to live like Jews? So now what this means, what it doesn't mean, is that Peter was living like a Gentile in that he was no longer following Torah, not keeping the Sabbath, or not eating kosher, that sort of thing. No, what he was talking about was Peter was eating, drinking, fellowshipping with the Gentiles as if he had no restrictions against that, because, if he was a Gentile himself, he would have no restriction with eating with the Gentiles. And that's what Paul is saying. Hey, you're acting like you're a Gentile. Even though you're a Jew, you're eating with the Goy here. And so if you're eating with them and you're acting like a Gentile, how can then you come in and agree with these Judaizers and say, oh yeah, well, maybe you need to be circumcised so that you can be like us. So he's Paul is really getting down on him, because that's what I was saying with Ray is that he said so Peter backslid. Yeah, that was one of the interpretation. The classic Christian interpretation was that Paul was getting on to Peter because he had backslid back into that nasty Judaism and following the law and stuff like that. And no, that was not what he was talking about. That because Peter still he still kept followed the law. He kept the feasts, and he kept Sabbath and all of those things. It was strictly table fellowship that Paul was talking about. And so this again, it does not mean that Peter was living like a Gentile. He was no longer following Torah. I said that, not keeping Sabbath, not eating kosher. He did all of those things, but he was eating and drinking with the Gentiles. And so for Paul, this was the height of hypocrisy, because it was Peter who went to the home of Cornelius and preached to him, and ultimately led him to faith in Yeshua. So, I mean, here to Paul is saying, hey, look, Pete, you're the guy that told us all about the sheet coming down when you're on that rooftop in Jaffa, and you go to Caesarea up there to talk to Cornelius, and you even go into his house, you eat with him, you preach to him, and then they ended up getting saved. They got the Holy Spirit, and you baptized them. You're the one that broke down the wall, bud. And so now you're telling us that, okay, because or whatever reason, I'm going to back away. And so Paul is really getting on to him. He went on to, I just want to tell you that verse 14 is where we get the term Judaizer. But I'll read the scripture here. It says in Galatians 2:15 and 18, we are Jews by birth and not sinners among the Gentiles. Paul is talking to Peter. It says, yet we know that a person is set right not by deeds based on Torah, but rather through putting trust in Messiah Yeshua. So even we have put our trust, even we, the Jews, have put our trust in Messiah Yeshua in order that we might be set right based on trust in Messiah and not by deeds based on Torah, because no human will be justified by deeds based on Torah. But if, while seeking to be justified in Messiah, we ourselves also are found to be sinners, is Messiah an agent of sin? May it never be. For if I rebuild the very things I tore down, I prove myself to be a lawbreaker. Those verses right there. My goodness, they will give you a headache if you try to think about them too far. So next week, actually, we are going to get a headache because I'm going to break down these verses even more and come up with some ideas so that when we add all the asides and the parentheticals and all of the descriptors here with some of these words and go into the Greek. Yeah, you'll have a headache, I promise you. But I could not get all of that into one lesson. So we're just going to leave these here. I'm going to hit some points. And again, Paul was telling Peter that if you, of all people, rebuild a sharp division between Jew and Gentile by removing yourself from table fellowship with Gentiles, you are rebuilding the barrier that you originally tore down. If you refuse to eat and worship with them, you rebuild the barrier that you originally tore down. You tore down the wall. So if you rebuild it, you are saying that you were wrong. You have been transgressing Yeshua's instructions all along. So, Paul had really taken it to Peter here. I mean, he didn't mince words at all. And so it's no wonder that Peter later on said, Paul's words are kind of hard sometimes. So Paul is saying, no one, Jew or Gentile, I need to say that, Jew or Gentile, is justified by the deeds of Torah. No one. He's saying that we all have to come to faith in Yeshua. So, how did Peter take the rebuke? We don't really know how. It didn't give us a blow-by-blow description of what they, how they talked and what they did. But we do know that in the later on in the Council of Acts, Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. What do we do? Peter was one that strongly defended Paul and this somewhat new theology that the Gentiles could fellowship with the Jews. So, you got to hand it to Peter. He's the impetuous one. Sometimes he made mistakes, but, in the end, I like Peter. In the end, he just sucks it up and says, yep, I was wrong, and we're going to do right next time. And he does, in his whole life. Everything that he would jump into something, but, by George, he would jump into it where everybody else was stepping back. So, you got to hand it to Peter. Nobody else stepped out of the boat except Peter. And he's always criticized for sinking because of his lack of faith. What about the dudes that were back there in the boat that would not even get out of the boat because they didn't have enough faith to even get out of the boat? So, Peter, he made a mistake. Paul called him on it, and Peter was a big enough man that he said, you're right. I was wrong on this thing. And so we could take a lot of instruction on this from Peter that, look at things, look at what the Bible says, and, be man enough or be woman enough than to say, ooh, yes, I was wrong, and let your ego take a hit, and compare it to what the Bible says, and admit that maybe you were wrong in something, and then go on with it. I think there's a real good lesson to go with that. Let's see, and I think that's going to conclude what I have tonight, because like I said, I wanted to get into these last 2 or 3 verses here, especially talking about the deeds of Torah and what those meant as compared to the trusting in Yeshua, because I mean, there's some rich stuff in here, and it's going to take me a while to develop that, and I just couldn't get it all done in the hour that we have tonight. So we're ending actually about 15 minutes early, so we can actually take a few questions here, and I've got some comments from Michael. It says, being a part of the Commonwealth of Israel places the Gentile believers under the Mosaic covenant, namely the Sinaitic covenant and all of the Torah laws. The Commonwealth or kingdom was established at Sinai. By the way, the Messiah is Israel's king. Our allegiance is to him. All right, now, all right, Michael, I'm going to disagree with you on that one. Let me unmute everybody, and I'm going to do that. I think that being a part of the Commonwealth of Israel does not put the Gentiles into the bloodline of the Mosaic covenant. It puts them within the Abrahamic covenant, where the promise was given to Abraham that his seed would include many nations, but only Israel is from Isaac and Jacob, from the seed, through Jacob and then the 12 tribes. So maybe you and I we're talking about a semantics here, possibly so, but the Commonwealth to me includes the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. Mosaic covenant being for the folks of Jewish descent, the Abrahamic covenant then being for the those that are not of Jewish descent, but are still believers in Messiah Yeshua. So we can probably we'll have to argue on that later on, because that'll be a good lively argument, I can tell. But that's okay. That's okay. We can do that. Let's see. And Michael also says Peter was a hothead. I can just imagine how he took Paul's rebuke. Yeah, we don't know. I mean, that would have been very, very interesting to see how he took it. Maybe, after all of the things that he's gone through with Yeshua, that possible that with all the things that Yeshua told him and talked to him about after his denial, and you can imagine when he met Yeshua at the Sea of Galilee, and he said that, Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? 3 times. So, I don't know. Peter's ego by that time might have been, just about an inch tall. So we don't know. I really don't know about that.
But he was also the one who cut off the ear.
Well, that was still before.
Something.
That was still before, though.
It was more important to do something.
I was saying, though,
it
was after the crucifixion that Peter really got his some comeuppance. So,
hey, Steve?
Yeah.
Just a question that might help to clarify this. Did Paul's rebuke of Peter, did it, on a timeline, did it take place before or after the Jerusalem Council decision
Um,
about?
I was trying to look this up today to just make sure because I thought this question might come up. And the best that I can determine is that this all took place before the Jerusalem Council. This, I think that a lot of this stuff was still in a state of flux. We know that Peter came up to Antioch just shortly after Paul and Barnabas came back from their first missionary journey in Asia Minor. So this kind of popped up, at the same time Paul is hearing about the Judaizers, the influencers, as Mark Nanos calls them, that were trying to undermine his work in Asia Minor to the Galatians. Then he comes here and he sees that, right here in Antioch, where I've been ministering for 2 or 3 years now with Barnabas, the same thing is happening again. So he rebukes Peter, and I think this is actually this takes place chronologically after Paul had gone to Jerusalem and spoken to James, Yaakov, and Peter. He said he spent 15 days with Peter up there in Jerusalem. So this took place after that, when Paul came back to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem and from his trip to Galatia. Then Peter came up and was teaching and preaching in Antioch, and he did that for a while. And then these folks from Jerusalem came up and kind of got everything turned on its head. That's the best chronology that I can come up with in terms of going back to Acts and trying to place these things in sequence.
Yeah, the other thing I think we should remember is, and we've mentioned it in the past, is that within the traditional Judaism of the day, in order for a Gentile, a non-Jew, to have a place in the world to come, which could be analogous to have, be saved, they had to go through rabbinical conversion, which included circumcision and ritual immersion.
That is correct.
That was the halakha of the day within traditional Judaism, and you would think that Peter, having that vision and the understanding that no, the good news, the gospel of Yeshua being Messiah and so forth, and salvation is independent of ethnicity, and that's exactly that's what the vision was all about, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
That's why he went to Cornelius. He finally got it, and this is the same understanding that Shaul had.
Right.
So Peter, I don't know, he must have really been entrenched within rabbinical halakha, within rabbinical Judaism, even at this time, even as a believer in Yeshua, to actually separate himself from the non-Jewish believers when these men from Jerusalem came down.
I think that possibly, thinking about some of this stuff here, I think that Peter could possibly have just been overwhelmed by the illuminaries, even though, and you consider, though, that these illuminaries were no more the Illuminati than he is, to use that word, because he was an apostle. But for some reason, when these guys came, and if they were, I just can't imagine how they would have had such a status to come down or come up to Antioch and start teaching this stuff, and Peter then fell for it. It's very it's inconceivable in some aspects that they could have done that, but I don't know. It did happen, and Peter had made a mistake there with getting into this. So it makes it all very interesting to see how all of this stuff was was still fluid. It was very fluid, trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do with the Gentiles? How are we going to eat with them, or how are we going to just interface with the Gentiles? It was, they were overcoming centuries, literally centuries of training and prejudices, if it were, and just custom, all of these things, and sincere belief that that's what God wanted them to do, is to totally separate themselves from the nations, and they, sort of forgot that part where God says, you're my chosen people, and I want you to be a light to the nations. So somewhere along the line, they missed out on the idea that, okay, we can be separate in one aspect. We don't have to we should not take on the gods and the customs and the idols and all that kind of stuff of the Gentiles, but we need to be pointing them in the direction of the one true God.